The Varen conquered had not lost a war in 214 years. 9 species, 1 command structure, 411 worlds under a single banner, ratified in treaty language so old that only the conquered's inner council still spoke it fluently. Their war college on Austral Prime had trained 11,000 campaign officers across 2 centuries, and every one of them learned the same lesson before anything else. The conquered did not fight wars it could lose. It fought wars it had already finished on paper before the first carrier left dock. 603 species had been contacted, absorbed, or quietly removed from any star chart worth consulting. The win rate sat at 97%. The remaining 3% were species so fractured by their own internal wars that victory over them had been closer to paperwork than combat. Humanity's file was opened in the 209th year of the conquered. By the 214th year, it had not been closed. It should have taken 11 months. The projection models, the same models that had correctly forecast the fall of the Drassy hegemony to within 6 days, gave humanity a 94% probability of formal surrender within a single fiscal cycle. The models were run 3 times. 3 times they returned the same number. The number was wrong 5 separate times over 5 separate years, and each time it was wrong in a different direction, which was the detail that eventually stopped being filed under error and started being filed under pattern. Colonel Idris Kane's service record entered the Conquered's archive in year 210, attached to a wristwatch that had been logged, scanned, and flagged by 3 separate intake officers before anyone thought to ask why a fleet commander was still wearing analog hardware that synced to nothing. He had not explained it. He had simply worn it through the intake interview, through the prisoner exchange that had put him briefly in Conquered custody in year 211, and through the 4 subsequent negotiations where he sat across the table from officials who had, by then, stopped being surprised and started being careful. The intake report noted the watch's model as pre-spaceflight civilian manufacture, of no tactical significance, and recommended no further action. The recommendation was correct on every point except the one that mattered, which was that Kane had been offered 3 replacement chronometers synced to Conquered fleet time across 4 years, and had declined all 3 without explanation, and had never once been late to anything as a result. Archivist Sale Turney's had read Kane's file more times than any other document in the War College's restricted collection. Not because it was long, it was, if anything sparse, the record of a man who did not generate much paperwork about himself. Turney's kept returning to it because of what surrounded it. 5 failed campaigns, each with a full command postmortem, and Kane's name present in 4 of them without ever being the stated target of any of them. He was not humanity's weapon. He was present the way weather is present, something the Conquered's models had not learned to account for because he never did anything that showed up as a variable. Grand strategist Vex Orun did not share Turney's patience for the file. Orun had risen through 8 successful campaigns and had never once needed to revise a doctrine mid-war. He regarded humanity's continued existence the way a senior engineer regards a bridge that has not yet collapsed under a load it was never rated for, not as evidence the bridge is sound, but as evidence the collapse is overdue. At the War Council convened in the 212th year, Orun proposed what the minutes recorded only as the finishing sequence: 6 coordinated actions, delivered in series, each one drawn from a campaign that had ended a different species inside a single year. He presented it the way certain strategists present a plan they have already rehearsed in private, with the timing and tone of someone who has stopped expecting to be questioned. Several council members smiled during the presentation. It was the particular smile that appears in rooms where a hierarchy has already decided which side of history it is standing on. It was, Turney's noted privately, the same smile the minutes had recorded in slightly different words at the opening session of every one of the Conquered's 602 prior victories, a detail he had checked, confirmed, and chosen not to raise that day. Kane was present at that council session as a courtesy observer, seated near the back, still wearing the watch. He was asked, almost as an afterthought, whether humanity had any response to the sequence being proposed for its own destruction. "That's a fair question," Kane said, in the tone of someone who genuinely found it fair. "Do you want the answer for the sequence or the answer for what happens after it?" Orun said the sequence would be sufficient, there would be no after. Kane said there would be an after. He did not elaborate. Turney's, seated to Orun's left, wrote nothing down. He had already written it down 2 years earlier. The council that convened after the 6th failed prediction did not discuss whether to escalate. It discussed only how. Orun's finishing sequence was not built from theory. Every action inside it was a doctrine borrowed from an actual completed war. 6 wars, 6 species, 6 single-year victories, stitched into a sequence that had never before needed to run past its second stage before an enemy broke. The Conquered had never had to use all 6. Humanity would be the first species in 2 centuries to see the entire catalog. The bombardment. The first action in the finishing sequence was orbital denial, the same doctrine that had ended the Korvath reaches resistance in 11 days. The doctrine assumed capital dependency. Cripple the home system's shipyards and command hubs, and a species loses its ability to project force within a single generation. The conquered fleet took Saul's outer shipyards in the 4th month. It was, by every metric the War College taught, a complete tactical success. Production capacity fell by 61% within the first 6 weeks. It did not fall further because the projection had measured the wrong thing. Human production had already migrated, not to a hidden capital installation the conquered had failed to locate, but to 11,000 small, disconnected fabrication shops spread across 4 continents and 2 off-world colonies, none of them individually worth bombing, none of them coordinated by any single command node a strike could sever. The Conquered's doctrine had been built on species that centralized. Humanity, it turned out, had spent its own history preparing, through habit rather than foresight, to keep functioning when the center did not hold. Orun called it an adaptation. Turney's in his private notes called it something closer to a reflex. He pulled the pre-war industrial census for comparison and found that the dispersal pattern had existed in miniature for decades before the Conquered had ever entered human space. A habit left over from an era of human history the War College had filed as irrelevant background reading. Nobody had assigned it to a strategist to study, because nobody had believed a species would organize its economy around a war that hadn't happened yet. Humanity had not organized around this war. It had simply never gotten around to unorganizing from the last several. The Shipyard Strike Group's own after-action report, submitted 11 days after the bombardment, described the result in language Orun found almost impossible to sit with. Full mission success, negligible strategic effect. He read that sentence 4 times before forwarding it to the council unedited. The plague. The second action was biological, a tailored pathogen calibrated against genetic sequencing pulled from 3 captured human soldiers. It had ended the Marrowan conflict in 9 days, against a species with low genetic variance and centralized medical infrastructure. Human genetic variance across the sampled population turned out to be an order of magnitude higher than any species the pathogen had previously been calibrated against. The weapon achieved partial effect in some populations and none in others, and by the time a second variant was engineered, human quarantine protocols, old, unglamorous, developed over centuries of unrelated disease outbreaks that had nothing to do with this war, had already contained the spread to a fraction of 1% of the population the models had projected. The Council did not discuss this failure long. There was little to say about a weapon that had been defeated by a defense nobody had designed for the occasion. Turney's noted, without including it in the official summary, that the quarantine doctrine in use across the affected regions predated the war by at least 4 centuries, and had been developed against nothing more exotic than seasonal illness. The Conquered had engineered a weapon against a species. The species had, without knowing it, spent 400 years engineering a habit against exactly this. The famine that didn't come. Between the second and third actions, Orun authorized a smaller measure that did not appear in the official sequence, but was, in his private assessment, a necessary supplement. The targeting of 3 agricultural distribution hubs supplying the largest human population centers. It had worked, cleanly and quickly, against the Threll Combine 4 years earlier, collapsing food distribution in under a month. The 3 hubs were destroyed within the same operational window. Conquered logistics projected famine conditions in the affected regions within 6 weeks. No famine was recorded. Local agricultural production, it emerged, had never been as centralized as the trade data suggested. A significant fraction of it occurred at a scale too small for orbital sensors to have flagged as productive at all, in facilities that did not look from above like anything worth bombing. Orun's analysts spent longer confirming this failure than they had spent planning the strike. The third action was cultural, a saturation campaign of tailored messaging intended to fracture civilian morale, the same approach that had ended the Thren Assembly's will to fight without a single additional shot fired. Human civilian populations received the broadcasts. They did not fracture, they edited them. Within 11 days, the Conquered's carefully engineered despair messaging was circulating through human networks reassembled into music, jokes, and at least one moderately popular animated short. The Conquered's cultural analysts, reviewing the results, noted with some discomfort that morale in the target regions had measurably improved. Orun requested a second, harsher variant. It received the same treatment in 9 days rather than 11. A junior analyst, in a note that was never meant to reach the council, observed that the target population appeared to treat despair as raw material rather than as an instruction. and that the Concord's messaging doctrine had never before been tested against a species with several thousand years of practice turning occupation, siege, and hardship into song. The note was filed. It was not acted on because there was no existing doctrine to act on it with. The embargo. The fourth action was economic, a full trade and resource blockade, the doctrine responsible for the bloodless surrender of the Kesset trade union in 14 months. Human supply networks, the models showed, depended heavily on interstellar trade. The blockade held for 7 months. It did not produce surrender. It produced instead a wave of quietly reactivated manufacturing techniques from before humanity's spacefaring era, techniques the Concord's own intelligence had dismissed as obsolete because they had stopped appearing in trade data decades earlier. They had not disappeared. They had simply stopped being profitable to use until profitability stopped being the relevant question. Concord economic doctrine carried one further assumption embedded so deeply that Orun's staff did not think to question it until the 8th month of the blockade, that a species under sustained resource pressure would fracture along internal lines before it found alternatives. Every prior blockade in the Concord's record had produced exactly that: fracture, factions turning against each other, local leadership collapsing into competing claims on scarce supply. Human regions under blockade produced black markets as well. What they did not produce was the fracture. The markets, when Concord intelligence finally penetrated one for observation, were found to be operating on informal rationing agreements that no central authority had issued and no treaty had required. The strike, the fifth action, was decapitation, a coordinated series of strikes against human command leadership, the doctrine that had ended 6 separate conflicts by removing the single point of failure at the top of an enemy's command structure. The strike succeeded. 4 senior human commanders were killed within the same 18-hour window. Concord analysts monitoring for the expected command collapse instead recorded full operational continuity within 4 hours. Human command structure, it emerged, had been built without a single point of failure for reasons that predated the war by centuries. The design was not a response to the Concord. It was inherited from conflicts against other humans, fought long before anyone in this war had been born. Kane was not one of the 4 commanders killed. He had been, for reasons the strike planning had not accounted for, in a location the intelligence had listed as low priority. The post-strike assessment took longer than any previous action in the sequence to complete, because the analysts kept returning to the same unresolved question: where was the gap? Every prior decapitation strike in Concord history had left a visible, measurable seam, a chain of command with a missing link, a chair no one else was trained to fill. Human command structure did not have a top so much as a lattice, and the lattice had been built that way for reasons that had nothing to do with the Concord at all. It was inherited, the historical review eventually concluded, from a much older habit of losing leaders to assassination, disease, and simple bad luck. Across centuries of conflicts fought entirely against other humans, long before anyone at this table had been born. The redundancy had not been designed for this war. It had been built, imperfectly and unevenly over generations, for the plain fact that leaders die and armies still have to eat that night. The fleet. Between the 5th and 6th actions, Orun made one final addition that appeared nowhere in his original proposal: the full mobilization of the Concord's 3rd and 5th fleets, a combined force larger than any single deployment humanity had yet faced, intended not to win a decisive battle so much as to remove any question of whether one was still needed. The fleets engaged at the edge of the Sol system's outer defense line. It was, by every prior standard the War College used to measure such things, the largest and most lopsided engagement of the war. Concord losses stayed within expected parameters. Human losses by the numbers alone were severe. The system did not fall. Tourneys, reviewing the engagement logs afterward, found the explanation less in the tactics than in a detail buried in the supply reports. Human shipyards, dispersed since the first action of the sequence, had spent the intervening months producing not new capital ships, but a very large number of small, cheap, expendable craft, built to a standard the Concord's own engineering review boards would have rejected as unacceptably crude. They were not meant to win the engagement. They were meant to make the engagement expensive enough that winning it stopped feeling like winning. The peace. The 6th action was not a weapon. It was an offer, a negotiated cessation, terms more generous than any previous Concord settlement. The approach that had ended 3 wars simply by giving an exhausted species a way to stop losing without calling it surrender. Human negotiators reviewed the terms for 11 days. Orun, watching the delay, allowed himself to believe it was the first sign of the exhaustion the sequence had been built to produce. The terms were declined, not with anger, not with a counteroffer designed to extract more. They were declined with a single clause flagged in the return document, requesting clarification on a jurisdictional detail in the treaty's fine print, a detail the Concord's own legal office confirmed after review had been an error in their draft. An error that corrected changed nothing in humanity's position and had cost the Concord 11 days it had not planned to spend. Turney's read the return document twice, not because it was complicated, because it was not. By the time the sixth action concluded, the War Council convened again, and this time no one was smiling. Orun stood at the head of the table with a folder he had not opened. "The sequence has concluded," he said. "It has," Kane said. "Humanity has not surrendered." "No," Kane said, "we haven't." Orun did not ask why. He had spent 6 actions and 2 years discovering why in fragments, none of them large enough on their own to explain 214 years of an unbroken record ending here. He asked instead the only question that was left: what would it have taken? Kane considered this with the particular stillness of someone doing an accounting rather than composing a speech. "Nothing you tried was wrong," he said. "Every one of those doctrines ended a war before us. You didn't miscalculate the weapons, you miscalculated what you were aiming them at." "Explain that," Orun said. "You built the sequence to break a center," Kane said. "A capital, a leadership, a morale point, a supply chain, a fleet that mattered more than the others. Every species you've beaten had one somewhere, even if it took a while to find it. We spent most of our history without one. Not because we planned for you. Because we spent a long time fighting each other, and a species that fights itself for long enough stops building things that can be broken in one place." Orun was quiet for a moment that the minutes did not record a length for. "That is not a strategy," he said. "No," Kane said, "it's a scar. You can't outplan a scar. You can only wait for it to stop hurting, and ours hasn't and won't for a while yet." Orun stopped at the door on his way out. He did not turn around. "The bombardment assumed a center," he said. "There wasn't one." "No," Kane said. Orun left without further comment. It was not a defeat delivered with anger, and it was not received as one. It was a man updating a model that had been correct 602 times before this, recalibrating for the 603rd. Kane gathered the single folder in front of him, thin, mostly blank, the same folder he had carried into every session of the council for 2 years, and stood to leave. The watch on his wrist read a time that matched nothing on the station's sync clocks, and had not for 2 years needed to. Turney's remained after the room emptied. He opened the Concord's permanent record on the sequence, the same record that had closed 602 prior campaigns with a single summarizing line each. He considered the file for a long moment before writing anything.